Okay, it's time. So we'll start this webinar.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining today's webinar. I do understand you are all very busy, so thank you for attending. Today, we are hosting this together with Waseda University Center for Business, the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry of the European Corporate Governance Institute. And the title for today's symposium is The New Era of Unsolicited Takeovers in Japan, Implication of Academic Research to Corporations and Institutional Investors. I will be the moderator for this symposium. My name is Kazunori Suzuki, and I am the researcher at the Waseda Business School.
Thank you very much for joining this webinar from abroad. My name is Icko Suzuki. I'm a professor at Waseda Business School. It is a pleasure to co-host this online and in-person webinar, jointly held by our Business Institute and RIETI, Research Institute of Economic Trade and Industry, and ECGI, European Corporate Governance Institute. On behalf of the majority of audience today, being Japanese, I'd like to host this webinar mainly in Japanese, but you will have the simultaneous interpretation on Zoom, so I hope that you will enjoy. And for the slides, some of the slides are in Japanese. We will post on Zoom the Google translated into English version of the slides for your sake, so that you're not going to be lost at what we are talking about. In any case, the discussion will be translated into English at the same time.
So today's theme is takeovers without prior consent, and this has been long tabooed in Japan, but as you know, this has been noticed and have frequently been carried out and completed since last year. In particular, since Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry published the guidelines for corporate acquisition in August 2023, we've seen several takeovers, such as Nidex acquisition of Takisawa or Daiichi Life Holdings acquisition of Benefit One. And currently, of course, the most talked about is the Canadian retailer Alimentation Couche-Tard's proposing a takeover without prior consent to Seven & I Holdings. So I do believe that the literal translation of their name is they are in the food industry or supermarket industry that's open until very late. But in any case, they have suggested that they would like to take over 7-Eleven or Seven & I Holdings. So today's symposium, we are glad to invite Professor Marco Becht, who is currently in Japan, and he will be making a keynote speech. Also, we will hear from legal researchers and practitioners familiar with the M&A field, and we will be talking about this theme, taking into account academic research in Europe and the United States. So first, I'd like to briefly introduce the organizations that are co-hosting this event. And then after this, we will have greetings from Director and Chief Research Officer, Professor Tomiura of RIETI. This is the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry, and this was established in 2001 and is a policy think tank. Its mission is to provide evidence-based policy recommendations through theoretical and empirical research by leveraging synergy with the policy field, and it has earned a high reputation both home and abroad for its activities over the past 20 years. Next, today's keynote speaker, Professor Marco Becht, currently serves as the Managing Director of ECGI, the European Corporate Governance Institute. This is a non-profit organization, and this is something that we call ECGI, and it was established in 2001. The primary goal is to promote independent scientific research to improve corporate governance. It has formed a network of over 900 researchers and practitioners from over 54 countries around the world, and I myself am also a member. And Waseda's Business and Finance Research Center is also working together with ECGI. So in fact, ECGI publishes many working papers every year, and they do join many international conferences. So I would like to thank the co-hosting of this symposium by ECGI researchers from all over the world. And I know currently about 100 people have signed up to join via Zoom. So probably about 60% is joining out of the 100. And lastly, I want to quickly introduce Waseda Business and Finance Research Center. Waseda Business School is a leading business school in Japan and Asia, and we are here to build an international network and conduct research activities and projects to accumulate practical knowledge that will serve as the foundation of our education activities. So this lecture series, A Global Insight, is held regularly to share the knowledge of overseas researchers who are conducting such a joint research with everyone. So sorry that took long, but to kick off the event, I'd like to hear from Professor Eiichi Tomiura, Director and CRO of RIETI. After that, I would like to hear from my colleague, Professor Hideaki Miyajima, Faculty Fellow at RIETI and Professor at Waseda University Graduate School of Commerce, who will introduce today's keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I am from RIETI. I am the president and CRO. My name is Tomiura. Thank you very much for the co-organizers. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to extend a few words. Waseda University and RIETI are holding this seminar together, and we have such a long history for this series of seminars. And this is a new event here today, and this is a great honor for us to be one of the co-organizers. Professor Miyajima, the core member, is a great contributor for RIETI, and he has been doing corporate governance-related projects for a long time, and he has achieved such great results. So taking this opportunity, thank you very much, Professor. And as was mentioned before, at the Research Institute of Economy, Trade and Industry, this is a think tank for economy, trade, and industry based on economics. So we are a think tank. And from this fiscal year, we have a new midterm plan, especially to contribute to the policy making. And we would like to strengthen our efforts for the policy making. As Professor Miyajima says, we are together with the policy making division. We have deep researchers on corporate governance. This is more and more important and relevant. The theme here today is acquisitions, takeovers, and for a long time, there was a stagnant economy in Japan. But after that, we are trying to expand investment, especially from outside of Japan. And also, the government is trying to focus on the growth of companies. And as we talk today, takeovers in Japan, we started to use different adjectives. We used to say hostile takeovers, but now we are using more and more unsolicited takeovers as a term. So how we can invite foreign investors to have disciplined approach. That's a very important theme for the policy making in our government as well. So I really hope that today's discussion is going to be very meaningful and fruitful. Thank you very much.
So my name is Miyajima from Waseda University. I would also like to make a few words. So I've been a professor at Waseda University teaching commercial business, and also I've been a faculty of RIETI, and I have been leading the corporate governance team. And in 2002, Professor Aoki, who was the chair at that time, suggested that we start this research, and it has been over 20 years since we have been researching about the latest problems related to corporate governance. So Japanese corporations were called to be the Japan type, and since then we have been following the progress of the Japanese corporations in our research group. And we have published works such as corporate governance in Japan and also M&A in Japan. Furthermore, we have invited overseas fellows or researchers and have been carrying out these kind of webinars or activities. And in 2023 or 2021, we worked with Colin Mayer, who is a professor at Oxford University, and we hosted a webinar titled A New Concept of a Corporation. And then in 2022, we looked into the new capitalism and ESG and corporate control, and we invited Julian Franks from LSE and also together with today's Professor Becht, we've been working together for a while now. And as Professor Suzuki mentioned, previously it was called a hostile takeover, but now it is called unsolicited takeovers. But this is truly a hot issue right now. So as the corporate governance team, we truly feel that this is an issue that we have to address. And it just so happens that Professor Becht is currently in Japan, so we thought this would be a perfect opportunity to host today's webinar. So that is the background to us hosting today's symposium. And now I would like to briefly explain or introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor Marco Becht. So he is currently the Goldschmidt Chair Professor at the Solvay Brussels School of Economics, and his main focus is corporate governance and responsible capitalism. Furthermore, he is a fellow and a founding member, as well as the currently executive director of ECGI, European Corporate Governance Institute. He has been leading their initiative. Also, other than that, he is a fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR. Professor Becht got his bachelor's and master's at London School of Economics, and also he earned his PhD at the European University Institute. Professor Marco has written numerous papers, and he has written many that is related to today's topic. For example, he has looked into the study of Hermes in his report, and also he has looked into the returns to hedge fund activism. This is also an international study, and this was actually reported in the Review of Financial Studies. Also, he co-wrote with Patrick Bolton the Corporate Governance and Control, and this report or study has been recognized as a basic or a foundational report in this field. And he has been cited more than 2,000 times. So now I would like to invite Professor Marco and have him make his keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you, Hideaki, for the extremely kind introduction. So the title of the okay, fine, okay. Sorry, I've been put in the right place. Okay. So the title of the talk is Barbarians at the Gate, Should Boards Just Say No? Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my own research, but I'm really going to draw on the research and the knowledge of people in the ECGI network, in particular the legal scholars, and I'm going to take an international approach to the subject. So if you want further readings on anything that I'm going to talk about, there's a wealth of material at ECGI Global, and we can also make further readings available for you. So this is really not mine. This is really an introduction to the topic of today based on the combined knowledge of the ECGI community. Now, when I arrived in Japan, or when we spoke about my visit, I found out that Japan is having, let me call it, a Cadbury moment. As you know, Cadbury had a hostile attempt from Kraft, the American maker of Philadelphia cheese. This caused some soul searching in the United Kingdom, and the same is happening in some sense in Japan at the moment. If you're not familiar with, if you've not been to Japan and you're not familiar with 7i, they are ubiquitous, and as the Financial Times said, it is Japan having taken the convenience store to perfection. I think you couldn't give a better description of 7i. Everybody knows it. Now, the idea that a French-Canadian company called Couche-Tard, nobody had heard about before, ever, could possibly take over the iconic 7i has really sent shockwaves through Japan. Now, you also know that they're offering, as one does, a large premium. Now, the question, of course, is going to be, where does that premium come from? But they are. Now, my initial reaction was, since I'm actually originally German, not far from Frankfurt, this reminded me a lot of Faust and the pact that you know about, the Faustian Pact. So what is the Faustian Pact? Japan has actually made a Faustian Pact with a market for corporate control. So my initial reaction was, why are you so surprised? So first of all, you have dismantled cross-shareholdings that traditionally used to protect Japanese companies. In addition, you've invited foreign investors to Japan, and we will talk about foreign investors more, but it is true that foreign investors care mostly about money, not about iconic Japanese things. In addition, you have dismantled your, actually, I read very proudly, you've dismantled your takeover defenses. In addition, Japan remains the focus of hedge fund activists, a growing breed with more money under management than ever before. And let's not forget, you are also the prime market that private equity is looking at. And here you have the headline, KKR's Kravis sees huge opportunity in Japan's undervalued firms. Now, private equity is not usually directly associated with hostilities, but with management buyouts. But you will see Mr. Kravis reappear in a few slides from now, so bear with me. So why then is this an important subject? Well, it is an important subject because it poses some really fundamental corporate governance questions. So the most fundamental question is, which decisions should shareholders delegate to the board of directors and which should they retain for direct approval? And I'll argue that there is a real dichotomy between the United States that delegates most things to the board and the UK that wants everything to go directly to the shareholders. So it retains many more decisions with the shareholders rather than delegating them to the board. So that's one aspect which is interesting. But more interesting is which matters should be decided exclusively by shareholders, therefore excluding others, notably bondholders and employees. So when, of course, you have insolvency or when you breach a covenant, then bondholders are involved. And as you will recall, in the case of Germany, employees make up 50% of the boards of large corporations. That is not true, of course, in Japan. So you've taken a different decision in that matter. Thirdly, which decisions should be made on a one share, one vote basis and which might involve alternative voting structures? Again, Japan has chosen one share, one vote, many other countries in the world, including the United States, have chosen differently, and thereby excluding both the market for corporate control and hedge fund activism. Finally, fourth, should independent shareholders have a separate say in certain decisions, for example, through a majority or minority vote? Now, this is very pertinent in countries where you have controlling shareholders, because how much power should these controlling shareholders have? It is not such a big question in Japan, but should you decide to adopt things like dual-class shares, that of course then also becomes a very pertinent question. And fifth, of course, when you talk about the takeover of iconic things, what should the role of the state, what role should the state have or not have in intervening in these kind of decisions? So the outline, those are the fundamental questions I'll not all answer, but I'll at least try to address, and I'm really trying to give an introduction also to the discussion. So the outline of my talk, of the remainder of my talk, is first I'll remind you of the market for corporate control narrative. I will then go briefly over to the US and look at the poison pill and the right to just say no. I will then go and ask the question, should target shareholders care what happens after a bid? And do they care? And we then moved on to Europe, in particular the UK, but that's also the rest of the EU, where you have the passivity rule, so board can actually not intervene, but I'll contrast the UK, which is completely open to any kind of control challenge, with a continent where people have made different choices. And I'm going to pick the example of the Netherlands, because that is the one that people might not be so familiar with. And then I will conclude with another question, the new area of corporate acquisitions from Japan, and then I'm out of time. So let me start by moving to the market for corporate control and just give you a reminder of this narrative, which really comes from Chicago. It comes from a lawyer, Henry Manny, and you're all familiar with the argument. It's Chicago arguing, well, if you're worried about inefficiently or less than optimally run corporations, they will trade at a discount, and then you can take over control, you can do everything right, and the world will be good because the market produces efficiency. So therefore, welcome the market for corporate control, as Japan, and Japan clearly has heard this message very loud and clear. Now, people in the United States, because remember this article was written in 1965, so this is Friedman, Chicago really at its best, and people in the US heard what they had to say, and of course this is the chart of the hostile takeovers in the US, which ran through the 1980s. Now you will also see the drop-off at the end, so this starts to drop off at the end of the 80s, and there are really two reasons. One is there was a backlash. So this is the book that gives this the title, Borrow and Helia, Barbarians at the Gate. It was about KKR's hostile buyout of RJR Nabisco, but it has become a label for these kind of hostilities in general. And of course, you've already met one of the barbarians in the previous slides, Mr. Kravis, so you now know what one looks like. What is the main reason, though, why the hostile takeover in the US disappeared? You all know the reason. It's the invention of the poison pill, invented by Martin Lipton in 1982. And then through a series of judgments, it was confirmed to be effective. And it did give the board the right to just say no to a hostile takeover. And will not go into the details how the pill works, but it effectively dilutes the voting power of the bidder and imposes very serious financial losses. And according to Stephen Davidoff, it's only been triggered once in living history, in living memory, so it is really a very effective deterrent device. Now, the other important feature about the pill is pills are always there even when you don't see it. So this point was made by John Coates in 2000, and he calls this the shadow pill. So boards can adopt these pills without shareholder approval at very short notice. Now, at this point, when I teach this to my students, they look in disbelief, they're Europeans, and I then use the example of Netflix that put in a poison pill shortly after Carl Icahn acquired 10%. And remember, Carl Icahn is another one of these barbarians from the book, a former raider, and his intention was to take over Netflix in a hostile deal. And that was shut down by the Netflix board by adopting a poison pill, and they effectively stopped Carl Icahn. He could not go through with that takeover. At that point, students still didn't believe me, but then, very fortunately, from that perspective, we had Elon Musk, who made his bid for Twitter, and within a day, the Twitter board put in a hostile pill. They put in a pill to thwart that hostile takeover attempt. Now, interestingly enough, afterwards we also learned that these pills are very expensive. So in this case, it cost $90 million US. So they are very expensive pills. If there are lawyers in the room, yes, they are expensive. But not everybody gets paid a percentage. Typically, lawyers, unfortunately, get paid by the hour. So this is really a privilege of Wachter Lipton. Anyway, I'm digressing. So what happened afterwards? Well, you know, Elon Musk got, as we all know, he got the takeover through. The board accepted the bid. And if the poison pill is so effective, why did the Twitter board accept the bid? Why did they not just say no? Well, there are a number of reasons for this, which the Financial Times duly reported on. So first of all, there was a substantial cash premium. So the chairman of the board had to say, well, there is a substantial cash premium, and we believe it is the best path forward for Twitter's stockholders. I should have underlined stockholders. Now, secondly, the company's directors also received calls from some of its largest shareholders, including active and passive investors. So in other words, if the Twitter board had not accepted, at the next time round, there might have been a proxy contest, and the board would have been replaced with nominees of one Elon Musk, maybe supported by hedge fund activists who wanted to cash in on the premium. So the board didn't even have a choice in that sense. Now, this is a general pattern. So this is an excellent paper by Slavoj Foss, The Disciplinary Effects of Proxy Contests. And in addition to documenting a lot about proxy contests in the United States, he has this chart which shows you that the gray is the hostile takeover. It's disappeared in the US. But the blue is the proxy contest that has appeared in the US. But that does not mean that the hostile takeover has disappeared. It has simply taken the form of you first take out the incumbent board and then you do a friendly bid because then the board actually welcomes the bid to go through. So in the case going back to 7&I, actually interestingly, 7&I was the subject of a hedge fund activist campaign before the hostile bid. So ValueAct made a long presentation about what it wanted to have changed, and it actually fielded 3 director candidates in a proxy contest for the board, except that ValueAct lost that election, so the shareholders did not agree to put the nominees of ValueAct onto the board. But you can ask the question, what would have happened if ValueAct had managed to put these directors onto the board of 7&I? Probably the board would have accepted the bid from Buchtach, or if not immediately, there would have been another round of another hostile board election in order to gain the majority on the board of directors, and then the bid would have been friendly. Now, by the way, if the bid fails, this is still, of course, a possibility. it is possible that you will have a proxy campaign in order to convince, in quotation marks, the 7i board to accept this bid or another bid. So the question then becomes, should target shareholders actually care what happens after a hostile takeover? And the first and singular finance view is no, because all the shareholders should really care about is the cash. So I forgot to mention this, hostile bids are usually cash offers because you take the cash and you go and do whatever you want to do, maybe report your success of the year and get a bonus if you're an asset manager or whatever it is you do, and then hopefully you sleep well at night, but you have cashed in on the premium and you've done your job. Now note, in proxy contests it is not so simple because you're not cashing out, you actually stay invested in the board, so in the company, so it does matter what the strategy is that's being implemented, for example, at the behest of Value Act. If you take an externality view, things become more complicated. So by externality view, I mean you are a large investor like GPIF, or you're a large investor like Nippon Life, who owns basically every single company in the stock market, and not just in the stock market, but you have a very large bond portfolio. Well, if the bidder does harm to the environment, for example, by increasing carbon emissions, drill baby drill, you know who that said, and or you put more sugar into the food, or you do something that is has negative health consequences in some other form, that might be very profitable and might explain the premium that you get from the hostile bid, but it could cause negative effects around you, which have negative effects for the other companies in your portfolio. And that could be a very good reason why you actually might want to vote no. Another reason could be, and that is a more finance reason, that all the bidder wants to do is take more risk. If you own bonds of the target, that could be bad. And also, if it could also be that you actually own the bidder rather than just the target. And if you own enough of the bidder, you know that bidders tend to overpay because of hubris and other things. So if the bidder is actually paying too much for the target, then you lose on the bidder side. You gain on the target side, but the question is, what's the net gain? We know that the bankers are going to gain, we know that the lawyers are going to gain, but are you as a diversified investor actually going to gain from that transaction? So if you take this broader view, the answer becomes less obvious of what you should be doing. Now, it is fair to say that these are very nice arguments, but we have abundant evidence that what target shareholders mostly see is the premium. So they mostly take the single finance view, and if the premium is large enough, these other externality considerations become secondary. And it's also true that there are not that many large, globally diversified investors around the world, although that is slightly contradictory with the increase in index investing that we've seen. Finally, there is this unfashionable term called ethics. Now, of course, this is supposed to be part of responsible investment. We have trillions invested now in responsible investment, and you would think a responsible investor should ask, what happens afterwards as a result of my decision? What is my moral obligation here? But I'm afraid, well, I'm not going to comment. So yes, responsible investors should care what happens afterwards to employees, but I'm afraid even those mostly see the premium and not much else. So should the shareholders of Twitter have said no? Okay, I've put you some of the headlines that we've had there, and you can contrast that with a slide I've showed you before. They said yes. Should they have said no? I let you answer that question for yourselves based on what I said before. Now, a little plug here at this point, if you want to hear more about, especially the last point about responsibility, Patrick Bolton is giving the Hart lecture on Thursday, and he's going to talk about elements of a theory of the responsible firm. And this is, of course, directly related because you can argue what Twitter is today, but certainly Brazil said it is no longer a responsible firm. So that, of course, relates directly what he's going to talk about. So moving to talking about the LSE, moving to the UK now. So the UK, of course, has a very different rule, and the rest of the EU has a very different rule from the US. There you put the decision to the shareholders directly. The board can make a recommendation to the shareholders, but the board cannot say anything. The board can certainly not say no to the bidder. It is up to the shareholders to decide. This is called the non-frustration rule. Now, if you combine this with the UK prohibition of any kind of takeover defense, that leads to the most active market for corporate control. And of course, you still have hostile takeovers there. You had the one I mentioned already, Kraft Cadbury. Pfizer was thinking about acquiring AstraZeneca, but then walked away. Otherwise, that would have been hostile. SoftBank bought Arm. That wasn't hostile. It was agreed, but it's still relevant. And then there was, of course, the attempt of Heinz for Unilever. But note, and people overlook this, Unilever is a PLC stroke NV. It had a Dutch part, and the Dutch part made it impossible to take over Unilever. And when the bidder discovered this and discovered that the Dutch were not in the mood of being bought by Heinz, they walked. It had nothing to do with sustainability. It was the ironclad Dutch takeover defense that made that deal flop. So in the UK, as I said, there was this Cadbury moment because Kraft took over Cadbury and they made promises which they did not keep. They said, we will keep the factories open, but they closed them. And then that caused a lot of thinking. Now, the takeover panel reacted, and today the bidder needs to disclose upfront what they intend to do about the employees, about the headquarters, about the factories, and so forth. Now, also, and this is revolutionary for the UK, the employees are now allowed to give their views to the shareholders, but the shareholders still decide. Now, I do not want to be cynical, but of course the bidder is going to promise all sorts of things, and then once you've made the acquisition, of course, things in business change. So if it then turns out afterwards that you have to close factories and that you have to lay off jobs and that you have to move the headquarters because business tells you that is what you need to do, sorry, it wasn't personal, it was just business. Okay? So this is really not a very strong commitment in any sense to the target. So again, it really comes down to the other points I made about, do the shareholders care what happens afterwards? So SoftBank bought Arm, and that of course raised other questions in the UK. Arm was supposed to be the champion of the UK tech industry, the example of a tech success. Okay? And as goes with these kind of companies, they did receive direct or indirect subsidies through funding for university know-how. They are based in Cambridge, just like AstraZeneca. So they get research money, they get positive spillovers from the university. Okay, and in this case, okay, good for Japan. Japan made this bet on Arm and managed to buy Arm. But certainly in the UK, the question is, do we want to sell our technology and a champion like Arm? Do we want to sell that really to the highest bidder on all occasions? Because that is the thing that we've committed to, being wedded to the market for corporate control in the way we are. So even in the UK, there's some thinking about this. But of course, with the last government, nothing has changed. Whether the new Labour government is going to change anything will have to be seen. The French, of course, never really had such a big problem with this kind of issue. So France is the country that by default now, where companies by default deviate from one share, one vote. So in the case of Carrefour, I want to stay with supermarkets and convenience stores. In the case of Carrefour, each share held in registered form for at least 2 years benefits from a double voting right. So that sounds a lot like dual class, except it gives you much less. So Galeries Lafayette, which stands behind Galfa, they go from 11 to 18% of the voting right. And the Brazilian family investment vehicle called Peninsula Europe goes from 8 to 14%. Okay, so that's not massive. And in fact, it so happens that Couche-Tard, actually before laying their eyes on Japan, in 2021, they made a hostile bid for Carrefour. Now, the loyalty share, the 10-year voting that I showed you was not sufficient to protect Carrefour from that hostile takeover attempt. But in this case, the French government stepped in and said that because that Carrefour is a strategic asset in the food sector, and that therefore, okay, and that's a legal question whether you're allowed to do this, but food is special because of food security, et cetera, they actually stepped in and stopped the takeover. So my lesson from this is, if you're thinking about dual class, 1 to 2 is not enough. You really have to go to 1 to 10 or 1 to 20, which is of course what the Americans do. Now, if you go to the Netherlands and you want 10-year voting, it's available there. And this is what Campari did. Italy offers you 1 to 2, but Luca Garavoglia, the controlling shareholder of Campari, said that's not enough for me. You either give me 1 to 10 or I move to the Netherlands. He's moved to the Netherlands. And there he gets 1 to 10 because when you hold the shares for 5 years, you get special shares that don't have economic rights, but they have 4 votes in addition to your vote that attaches to your normal share. And if you hold for 10 years, you get an additional 9 votes if you hold on for long enough. And by the way, he's just voted that he's now going to go to 1 to 20. So now you get 20 votes. So he's gone to 1 to 20. So the Netherlands on the whole is the country in Europe that gives you the largest variety of takeover protections, because that's what you need in Europe, since the shareholders decide if you want to protect yourself against a hostile bid and shareholder activists. And you can have dual class, you can have 10-year voting, as I just showed you, but the most intriguing instrument is the Dutch Foundation. Why is that so intriguing? Because certainly dual class absorbs some liquidity. The foundation absorbs no liquidity. Now, liquidity is important, as you know, because of free float adjustment, and I think the Tokyo Stock Exchange has just made liquidity one of the requirements. If you want protections with zero absorption of liquidity, the Dutch Foundation is a very good instrument for achieving that. Now, you look puzzled. Okay, so let me just go through the 3 uses that people make of the Dutch Foundation in the Netherlands. The first one is you can have a priority share foundation. So you have a few shares in the protected company that have special rights. For example, the governance right to be the sole entity that can nominate candidates for election to the board. Now, this sounds very odd. Shell used to have this until a few years ago. So Shell had a priority share foundation that had the sole right to nominate directors to the board. Why is that important? Because if you have a hedge fund activist or value act who come to nominate candidates, they can't, because only the foundation can nominate directors for election to the board. So this helps against hostile takeovers. It also helps against hedge fund activists. The other one is the trust office. In the US, this is known as a voting trust. You place all your shares into the trust, and then the trust issues certificates that do not have any voting rights. And it is these certificates that are listed on the stock exchange. So if you look carefully at Dutch companies, you will find that many of the companies where you think you're buying shares, you're actually buying certificates. And the trust administers these certificates and exercises the voting rights. Now, how then certificate holders' wishes translate into votes and into the board, that is up to the people who write the statutes of the foundation, because you can give yourself your own rules. Now, the one that is perhaps even most intriguing is the so-called continuity foundation, because that is very similar to the Japanese poison pill, except that it's more sophisticated. So it works with unissued preference shares, and the preference shares will get issued to the foundation when the foundation calls the shares, and they will both dilute the voting rights of the bidders, but also the economic rights. So they are really very much like a poison pill, and there are no preemptive rights, which is of course important so that this thing works. Now again, this is not fiction. Again, staying in the world of supermarkets, this is my local supermarket in Belgium actually, resulting from a merger of Ahold, the Dutch supermarket chain, with Deleuze, a Belgian supermarket chain. So Royal, and it's Royal, okay, Royal in Japan, Imperial, it would be Imperial. So Royal, Ahold, Deleuze, and they have exactly this idea. So if there's a hostile bid, they can issue preference shares, issue them to the Continuity Foundation. Where does the Continuity Foundation get the money from to pay for purchasing the shares? Well, they get a loan, and they pay the interest on the loan with the dividends they get on the preference dividends they get on the preference shares. Okay, lawyers in the room nodding, genius, okay, so absolute genius. Okay, so of course then it depends what you write into the statutes of the foundation. Now in the case of the continuity of the Ahold, Royal Ahold Continuity Foundation, it says that Ahold, Deleuze, KAD, the company, and all stakeholders in KAD and its subsidiaries, and to avert to the best of its abilities the influences that might conflict with those interests by affecting the company's continuity, independence, and identity. So that's a very broad sentence, but the Continuity Foundation basically has the mandate to think about the kind of things that I talked about before. So if Elon Musk had chosen to make a bid for them, they could have just said no to Elon Musk based on this particular foundation statute. Now, you can also combine these three things. So there are Dutch companies that don't just believe in one of these. So you can combine these things. And this is just a chart that shows you that. So let me then turn to the final question, which is the era of unsolicited takeovers from Japan. This is not my invention. This is the Financial Times. When Nippon Steel made the offer for X, or for US Steel, the Financial Times said, well, Japanese corporations are loaded with cash. Are they now going to go back to their old ways and make all these acquisitions abroad? Maybe. Now, this is the chart what happened with X. When Nippon Steel made its bid for X, X shareholders were very happy because they already saw a 30% premium in front of them. They also did not put in a poison pill. They did not say no. They said yes, please. Okay? Now, the Nippon Steel shareholders, though, should have been less pleased because the Nippon Steel share price went down by almost 10%. So the Nippon Steel shareholders should have said no, 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 no. Okay? Now, that's not what they said. It was even reported in the newspaper. Now, you then know what happened next. This on 15th of March, 2024. President Biden said no takeover of Nippon Steel of US Steel by Nippon Steel. And then, Japan said, oh, this is such bad news. Well, it was bad news for the US Steel shareholders, but it was good news for the Nippon Steel shareholders because the share price went back up. So maybe actually President Biden did Japan a favor. Now I hear that President Trump might actually allow the deal, but maybe you want to think about that as Nippon Steel shareholders again, whether Nippon Steel is actually paying too much. Now, this is actually a very serious question. So I've got a research paper on this question, which looks at the UK, where shareholders not only have a say on corporate takeovers, so they directly decide on whether to accept the bid or not. When the acquisition is relatively large, shareholders also have a say on the acquisition. So if you want to be consistent and you believe shareholders should have a direct say on these very large, important decisions, make it the same for takeovers and for acquisitions. Now, the US doesn't have this, but in some sense, the US is consistent about this. It says, we first appoint a board, don't intervene with the way that shareholders appoint a board, and then we delegate to the board both the decision to initially negotiate with a bidder, but we also delegate to them the power to make acquisitions. Now, empirical evidence shows that they are really very bad on the latter. US corporations make very bad acquisitions over time. So boards have really not done very well on that. So maybe shareholders should actually take that right back from the board and make that decision themselves. So if there's a new era of takeovers in Japan, at least in the acquisition space, give it to the shareholders. Now, as I said before, is that enough? If you also care about other things, when you talk about takeovers, probably not. So what should you do? Well, you should think about all these things that I said before. Let me, for the benefit of the translators, read the last slide. So what are the conclusions? So first of all, in hostile takeover situations, institutional investors have shown to put share price premia before any other consideration. Secondly, the highest bidder is not always the one that brings improved efficiency. Third, hostile shareholder activism evolves around contested board elections. If successful, this often leads to friendly bids and corporate restructuring, and friendly is in quotation marks. Next, pre-bid defenses provide little protection against contested board elections. And the last point, companies that seek a large free float and protection against hostile control contests must put in place pre-bid defenses like 1 to 10 or 1 to 20 dual-class shares, tenure voting, or Dutch-style foundations. In terms of their control, do Japanese corporations want to be British, American, French, Swedish, Danish, Dutch, or something else, maybe Japanese? I will let you think about this, and maybe actually Japanese corporations should be given a choice. And if the Japanese government doesn't give you a choice, remember, we have a free trade agreement, and Amsterdam is a very nice city. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco, for the very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I really enjoyed the last question, the last question from the one from the last. We want to be French, British, Dutch, whatever is probably fundamentally a good question to ask for us. Now that the foreign threat of the unsolicited takeover is real. Anyway, so we still have about 5 minutes. If there is someone who'd like to ask questions, we are happy to take that. Is there anyone on the floor? Or online, please put your Q&A, and I'm looking at it, so please give some thoughts.
If you have questions, could you please write it down in the Q&A box, and we would like to pick up your questions.
Any from the floor? No?
Anyone from the floor?
Any online questions? No. So maybe we'll leave the time for the discussion. I believe that the panel will present some additional views, and then we are going to have more lively discussion. So please send out your questions online continuously. We are going to watch them. So don't wait until the final moment. And I hope that we are going to discuss this.
If you have any discussions during the break, could you please write down your questions online? And I would like to pick up the questions. Do we have some questions? I can't see it, but we seem to have a question.
Okay, one question. Yes, how important do you think it is to give competing bidders access to due diligence? That's a bit of a, yeah. Okay.
It's important if you want the best price, but it's also important if you think that people are serious about considering other things than the price. You do want to give them other information as well. So yes, everybody should have access to due diligence.
Okay. All right. So that was the question from Bruce Dyer online. Okay, we're going to take a break for 10 minutes, and then we'll come back at 4:10. Is that the 4:10 to start the panel session.